Hello, this is Environmental Psychology Part 3, the history of the use of wind energy worldwide and in New Jersey. This is a project that's affiliated with the New Jersey Offshore Wind Initiative. My name is Sean Duffy. I'm a professor at Rutgers University in Camden, New Jersey. So what I want to do in this series of slides is talk a little bit about the history of the use of wind and also talk about some of the local and international aspects of wind energy. So it'll be kind of a general talk about this. So let's go back to the origin of wind energy. The first place that we know that people started using wind was in ships and boats. And so what Egyptians began using sailboats on the Nile River as early as about 5000 BCE. We don't have much evidence of before that time. There's not all that much written or existent history on this. So that's about the first time that we see people taking advantage of wind in a sort of systematic way. And what it really allowed their civilization to grow and quickly engage in trade with other civilizations, and really is one of the first origins of culture and cities such as Alexandria and other places that really became the fountainhead of our modern society. Now, there was a hero of Alexandria. Alexandria was actually a city with an enormous library and lots of science going on. And this individual hero of Alexandria built what's thought to be the first wind-powered machine. And we're not exactly sure what that may have looked like. It probably was a machine that had sails, much like in this next image, which is actually a Chinese invention. And what the Chinese did was to use windmills as early as 2000 before the Common Era to pump water and irrigate agriculture. And so you can see that this is a very rudimentary kind of a sales system. But it was very effective. And they were able to expand their own society through harnessing the winds. Persia and the Middle East also used reed-woven fan blades to create pumps. So we've been using wind for quite a long time. Now, windmills first came to Europe in about the 1100s and were commonly used in the production of food. So one of the things that we have harnessed wind to do is to take these round stones, and scrape them together and put wheat between them, and that creates flour. And again, bread has been a staple of our human culture for at least 10,000 years, 12,000 years. And so allowing machines to do this and harnessing the winds makes it much easier because it's very labor intensive to actually mill flour by hand. And it helped transform agriculture and foodways. And it allowed for the spread of different kinds of food like bread as a staple starch in European diets. But also, they were commonly used to pump water. I mean, if you've ever seen someone use a hand pump, there's a lot of energy to raise water from 50 or 100 feet below the surface of the earth. So using this wind energy to be able to pump water is a very effective thing, and particularly to be able to pump water from low-lying areas that allowed for more agriculture. So say in the Netherlands, which is below sea level, they were able to use these pumps in order to move water away from areas that were inundated with water and able to get more agriculture done. Now, what about the production of electricity? The first wind turbine, if you could call it such, was developed in 1888 by a man, Charles Brush, who built the first windmill that was directly attached to a primitive generator for the production of electrical power. But it really was the Danes that developed this technology in the early part of the 20th century. Wind conditions there are very beneficial for being able to have a constant flow of air, and so they took advantage of this and really used this technology. Now, it also was common in America. I'm sure if any of you have traveled through the American Midwest or the West, you've seen these kinds of these blade mills that were very easy to install, and you can see this ad: "Let the wind pump your water for nothing. Why pay for gasoline when wind is free?" And so these were basically very useful pumps to be able to get groundwater up and be used in agriculture. But also, it was commonly used in sawmills and for other grist mills that were used to produce food. But wind became a very staple of this economy, and it allowed there to be power, whether it be mechanical power or electrical power, at a very early period in the development of this country. And it was great because in rural areas, particularly with the beginning of electrification, you didn't need to, it was very hard to develop these power lines and the infrastructure. So if you have an individual farm and you can install one of these windmills, you have an access to a free power source. And that was something that was very advantageous. So, but things changed. So since the discovery of oil in the late 1800s, for much of the 20th century, oil was relatively inexpensive, readily available, and in abundant supply. Um, and the development of the combustion engine allowed for the development of various industrial tools as well as the automobile. And so combustion engines really became the more common way of producing energy. And there really wasn't all that much development in the wind sector from the early 1900s, really, until, say, the 1970s. Now, of course, as I've said in an early module, um, people have long known the effects of burning fossil fuels and how CO2 can change the climate. I don't know that people took it all that seriously, though, because it wasn't something that was really on the front of people's minds. But we did know that there are consequences, long-term consequences of the burning of these fossil fuels. But a lot of this really changed in the 1970s. For one, in the 1960s and 70s, there was a greater attention being paid to environmental degradation um, and environmental catastrophes. So in 1962, Rachel Carson published the book Silent Spring, which was about the use of the chemical DDT, which was commonly used to control things like mosquitoes and other pests. But it also had a real negative consequence on birds, particularly birds that would eat these pests that were affected by DDT. And it began sort of an awareness of the importance of protecting our environment. In 1970, Earth Day was first established, where there was a general recognition that there are problems that humans are impacting the Earth in ways, and that these are things that we need to address. In 1970, the Clean Air Act, and in 1971, the establishment of the EPA by the Nixon administration was really important for being able to control a lot of the pollutants that were going into both the atmosphere and our waters, and also the establishment of the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that was established to certain measuring the impact of what human activities and particularly industrial activities were happening on the atmosphere and the climate. And in 1971, Greenpeace was established, which was sort of an activist organization that really kept these issues in the public sphere. Now, a very important development that occurred that really affected a lot of the ways in which we thought about energy was the oil crisis of 1973, where the price of oil increased rapidly due to a variety of reasons, and many of them political. But the fact is that there was a shortage of oil, and it began making Americans begin to think about alternatives to fossil fuels. Of course, uh, once prices went down again, um, it seems like human memory can be short about these issues, and that when the price of oil is low, you find car manufacturers manufacturing larger cars. You find that people don't worry about these, but the price of oil and its fluctuation really allows Americans to think about possible alternatives. So and that really started in the 1970s. Now, through the 1980s and through the 2000s, there really was a lot of technological growth in the wind turbine industry, where they developed different larger turbines that were more powerful, that were able to produce more energy. Recall that some of the earlier ones that we talked about, the ones that you find on farms, these are good for powering pumps, very small amounts of electricity. But as you scale up, the amount of electricity that can be produced can get relatively large, to the point that these are producing, um, you know, many kilowatts of energy. So, so these structures got larger, and they also developed different kinds of these structures. Here's a little animation of three different types of designs for wind turbines. The first is a vertical axis wind turbine, where there are these fan blades that are sort of shaped like this C kind of a shape, the letter C, and wind blows and moves it around a vertical axis. There is an alternative to that, which you see in the far right, that use a different shape blade. But in reality, it's the horizontal wind turbine, the ones that we most commonly see as you drive throughout the country, and the huge white ones that you often see. These are the ones that are the most powerful and that provide the greatest amount of power. And this is one of the reasons why these are the most common ones that you will see. So, what are the parts of a wind turbine? Well, first, there's a foundation. The wind turbine needs to be very firmly, anchored to the ground if it's a terrestrial wind turbine. It also needs to have an electrical grid connection. This is something that we, often don't think about when we're considering wind turbines, but it needs to be connected to a grid, and there needs to be technology that allows the balancing of power so that it enters the grid in the correct way. This again is not my wheelhouse, but like there's three phases of electricity that you need to maintain. So there is all of this technological aspect that, other people that are developing modules for the Wind Institute will be talking about. Um, then you have the tower structure itself, which is the structure that leads up to the turbine at the top. And within that, there's an access ladder that allows workers to be able to climb to the top of the tower. Um, Now, at the top, there is a wind orientation control, which is a um, structure that allows the turbine to face, a motor that allows the turbine to face in the right direction of the wind. Because when the wind changes direction, you would like the actual turbine itself to change directions. And also, there are periods where you want the turbine not to be as influenced by the wind, for instance, when maintenance is being done. So, by being able to control this, to be able to orient the actual fan blades towards the wind or against the wind in such a way is an important control. And also, that's important if the wind increases to a point that becomes dangerous. You may need to make the angle more oblique so that the blades actually spin less, not so fast, because you don't want to damage the actual physical structure. Um, Now, the outside of the top part is called the nacelle, and that contains the turbine and the generator. Um, Now, at the very top, there's something called an anemometer, which measures the wind direction and speed, and that's important for the control computer that's controlling the direction of the turbine to be able to know in what direction it should be facing and what direction to move in. There's also a brake, because at times you do want the actual turbine to stop moving, and so there's a brake on it that allows it to stop so that maintenance can occur, or you know, uh, oil being changed or a lubricant being changed. So to be able to stop it is very important as well. Um, Behind the actual blade, the rotor blades themselves, is a gearbox, and what that gearbox does is it changes the rotation speed from a rather slow speed to a really high speed that feeds into the generator. So whereas the fan blades are rotating around in, a slower fashion, the gearbox increases the rate of speed of that rotation so that when it drives the generator, more power can be produced. There's also a blade pitch control because um, you don't want just the angle, but you also sometimes need to change the pitch depending on the wind conditions. And then the rotor hub, which is the front of the turbine that faces the wind, and that's the axis around which the actual blades rotate. Now, with respect to offshore wind, it's often asked, well, what about how do you have these turbines in the sea? Well, it depends. Certain turbines are called monopiles that look just like terrestrial on land turbines, but they are just embedded in the seafloor. Okay? And these probably are the most common ones that are in existence at this point. However, they're only able to do this in about 0 to 30 meters of water because at a certain point, uh, the distance becomes too large. There's a second kind that are called jacket or tripod, where they have a structure underneath the sea that emerges from the sea, and a monopile is a single standing turbine is connected to the tripod itself. This allows the engineers to be able to design turbines that will be able to work in 25 to 50 meters. Now there's also floating structures. This is in water levels that are deeper than, say, 50 meters, and these tend to be even larger still. But what they have is they have the component platform on which the actual turbine floats, and they're attached to the floor with by a tethering chain, and that allows them to be able to operate in deeper waters. And so here you see three different kinds: TLP, semi-submersed, and what's called spar. So you can actually have these offshore wind turbines in water as deep as more than 120 meters. So what this does is it really opens up the door to be able to have wind energy much further into the sea than which was possible before. So now what I'd like to talk about briefly is a bit about wind resources around the globe and in New Jersey, because it's useful to consider what is going on in the world and also locally. So, of course, as I said in an earlier, just briefly, I'll repeat it here. Wind energy uses a renewable resource that's unlimited. Wind is not going to disappear from the face of the earth. We're not going to run out of wind in the same way that we're going to run out of crude oil at a certain point, or other limited resources. And of course, as I said in an earlier module, wind originates from uneven heating of the Earth's surface, along with Earth's rotation. Again, I'm not an atmospheric expert, but that seems to be, the majority of wind is produced by differentials in heat. These turbines use these what are called foils or blades that rotate around the fixed point. And a portion of the wind's kinetic energy then gets converted into electrical energy by the rotation of magnets within a generator. And the ideal wind speed for the generation of electricity is between 9 and 13 miles per hour. The best places to put wind turbines are places that have a constant wind speed around that area. And so here what we have is a map of the wind speeds, average wind speed, all across the globe. Now, in this particular graph, it seems as if the kind of yellow and orange are probably the best places to put wind. Places that are bluish, the wind is too slow to have, it's below 9 miles an hour, and the places where it's deep red, the wind might be too fast. And that might be problematic because with the technology that we have today, with wind turbines, they have to go at a constant speed but not too fast. So that's you can see around the world there are lots of locations where wind is a very good resource for being able to produce electricity. Now, fortunately, in New Jersey, we have conditions that are really good and conducive for wind turbines, particularly off the coast in southern New Jersey. There are lots of areas where the wind speed falls right in that sweet spot between 9 and 13 miles per hour. And so, this is one of the reasons why New Jersey has been looked at as one of the places where there's greatest potential for the development of wind energy in offshore wind in the United States. So, in recent years, New Jersey really has taken a front seat in the development of offshore wind, and a lot of this had to do with the governor Phil Murphy, who said there's no other renewable energy resource that provides us with either the electric generation or economic growth potential of offshore wind. When we reach our goal of 7,500 megawatts, New Jersey's offshore wind infrastructure will generate electricity to power more than 3.2 million homes and meet 50% of our state's electrical power need. Our offshore wind industry will generate billions of dollars in investments in New Jersey's future and in turn create thousands of jobs. This is something which I think we often forget about is that when you install wind turbines, they need to be maintained. There's construction costs. There are lots of jobs to be had in the production of this. It's not just a matter of impacting energy, but it's also an economic boost for the state. But this is also related to more of a national push as well. So back in 2022, the Biden administration announced new actions to expand U.S. offshore wind energy. So what they are hoping to do is to launch initiatives on floating offshore wind to deploy 15 gigawatts of power to be able to power 5 million homes and lower the cost of electricity by 70% by 2035. So this is an ambitious project, and it's one that is only possible through the support of federal and local state agencies. What we have here is a map of some of the proposed locations for New Jersey offshore wind farms. Now, none of these are developed yet. There are a couple of testing locations that they're looking at, but for the most part, these are locations that there have been bids for by companies to be able to put in offshore wind. Here is just a zoom in because it's kind of hard to see in that other. But here are some of the locations where there's proposal to add offshore wind locations. As you can see, these are kind of far off the shore. One of the things that when I've gone around and spoken to people in New Jersey about offshore wind, what people's perception is that these things are going to be on the beach. So you're going to go to Ocean City or Cape May, and these things are just going to be jutting right there off of the beach, and that's not the case. Most of these wind farms are at least 5 miles from shore. Many of them are even further out still. But these that's one of the misconceptions I think that's important to try to correct is that many of these wind farms aren't going to be quite visible from the location that one might be standing at the shore. Of course, if you have a boat and you go out into the ocean, yes, you would be able to see them. But this ends up being like one of the issues that comes up with whenever people talk about offshore wind is how will it affect the visual ecology or the visual aesthetics of the environment. And as it turns out, a lot of these locations for these proposed sites are pretty far off from the actual shore. What about different states? Well, these are different stages that you can see. So there's the planning stage, the site control, the permitting, the under construction, and the operating. As you can see, there's very little operating offshore wind at this point. Only a little bit in New York, and I believe in at this point in Connecticut. But for the most part, offshore wind is not here yet. It is a plan for the future. And you can see that different states have different amounts of planning in the works. New York has a lot of site control going on and a lot of permitting. Um, you know, Massachusetts, New Jersey is third in the list here, and so this is where we're at this point. So the idea is that this is a future technology. This is something which we're developing now and implementing now. But what we propose, so it is just another way of looking at that same idea, is that by 2030, we'll have gone from zero capacity to a very large capacity of being able to produce like 300 megawatts of power um, by 2030. And so there's a lot of potential here. So you can see growth is, the future of this technology. Now, what are some of the behavioral, motivations for this? Well, of course, as a behavioral scientist, I always go back to economic factors being the first to make people believe in something and make something happen, right? Incentives really move people to do stuff. So there are a lot of economic benefits to invest in renewables such as wind. The first being that it creates jobs, both, as I said before, in the construction phase and also in the maintenance phases of the projects. So this is according to the Department of Energy, the economic impacts of offshore wind. If we get 30 gigawatts by 2030, this will produce 77,000 jobs, 44,000 that are employed in offshore wind, and 33,000 additional jobs in communities with offshore wind activity. So when you think about, the fact that there are, fisheries, right, that can only fish during certain months of the year or once a boat reaches its capacity, and it still has, you know, these wind turbines are going to need people to shuttle, workers from turbine to turbine. That could be a potential way in which someone who's a fisher could, repurpose or get extra revenue from these projects. So there's lots of ways in which this will provide an economic incentive for many people. Investment, both from government and from industry, of $12 billion a year. So there's a lot of investment to be had in this. Um, and also investment in ports. In order to install these, there's going to need to be upgrades in our port infrastructure. And so that's something that might benefit in the long run, not just the wind industry, but other industries as well. And this is onshore wind, but I think that this also will apply to offshore wind. When you look at over time from the early 1980s to the current age, the cost per kilowatt hour of wind energy has only gone down, and this is a bunch of different countries. But you can see the general downward trajectory of this plot. That wind energy is just gets cheaper and cheaper as the technology becomes more established and better, as the materials become more easily readily available. The cost of this has gone down. So whereas in the early 1980s, this was more of an experimental kind of technology, a new technology, uh, wind has been maturing and really has gotten to a point in which it is an established industry in and of itself. You also find that there's a lot of public support for wind energy. Now, a lot of what my modules are going to deal with is going to be the minority of individuals that do not support wind, why they don't support wind, and how one can communicate with people who don't support wind about the benefits of wind technology. So let me just show you some of these statistics. In general, most Americans support expanding the use of solar and wind power. So if you look at this graph right here, you can see that 84% of people favor expanding solar panel farms, and 77% of people support expanding wind power. You find much less with other kinds of carbon neutral wind, nuclear power, and of course, all of these other technologies that are fossil fuel based technologies, you find much less support. So, in general, in America, there really is a lot of support for wind and solar renewable energy. Um, so, majorities of Americans, this is related to the last graph, suggest that and see that wind and solar power are better for the environment than most other energy sources. But the public is divided on cost and reliability. A lot of concerns that people have to do with, if we already have coal plants, if we already have, natural gas plants, should we invest in the building of this new infrastructure and this new technology? Is it more reliable? People have concerns about the fact with solar energy that only works during the day, or that wind energy, it only works where there's wind and when there's wind. So I think that that's something that people keep in the back of their mind, is that, and one of the things that when I talk to people about this, I try to frame solar, wind as being one of a basket of technologies. I don't think that we're going to be able to, in this century, be able to completely divide ourselves from fossil fuel production of electricity. I don't know what's going to happen in the future with new technologies such as fusion. The world could change in 20 years. But for the most part, we need to consider all of these as part of a basket of technologies that we use to produce electricity. Um, I just wanted to point this out because it's kind of just interesting to know. You find that younger adults support wind, far more than older adults. There's also a political dimension to this. In general, survey after survey has showed that people who are relatively conservative tend to favor fossil fuel use. Those that are a little bit more progressive tend to favor renewable energy. And that's something that we'll talk about in a later module, is, the role of this idea of conservatism and what it means to conserve. But another motivation we should think about is what's going on beyond our shores, right? Because we need to think of ourselves as being in competition with other nations. And we would not like to have it be the case that other nations get far beyond us in their application of this kind of technology. So other nations have established offshore wind energy projects, such as Europe and China. They already have a head start. So what we see here is a graph of the share of electricity production from wind. This is all sources of wind, both onshore and offshore, I want to point out. What we find is that many European countries have really made headways, particularly Denmark, in the application of wind energy. But you can see that a lot of nations are adopting this. China. There are deserts in China where it is wind turbine after wind turbine into as far as the eye can see, because they realize the benefit of this technology. So here's the countries mainly in Europe on the share of electricity generated by wind power. And as I said, Denmark is a leader, but from South America, Uruguay. But most of these countries are, Kenya and Africa, Nicaragua and Central America. But, a lot of these countries are catching up to European countries in this technology. So we're finding that it's becoming more and more a part of that basket that I was talking about, that most energy countries are using to supply energy. Here's wind power generation measured in terawatt hours, and what we can see is that the newest data has shown that since 2015, China really has run away from other countries in the application of wind technology. They have been having major infrastructure projects with wind, where huge swaths of desert have been used for wind that otherwise were not being used for anything at all. The United States is catching up, though. And again, you have to consider also the size of these nations and the population base of these nations. So there's that to keep in mind. But you can see that, the United States is, increasing its use of wind energy since the early 2000s. And what about by region? The largest region seems to be the Asia Pacific region. That's generally driven mainly by China. Europe is the second largest, and North America. But we can see that this technology. I mean, if you look back in 1990, all of this was almost at zero, and here we are at 1,800 terawatt hours, an enormous amount of power being produced by wind, and the potential is only there for growth. So it's a really interesting field to study. But let's put this in context. What are the technologies that are producing the most within the framework of the renewables? Hydropower still is the largest. We've been building dams for far longer than we've been building electrical turbines. So hydropower produces a much larger, and a lot of these countries, China, if you think of the Three Gorges Dam, and in South America, the largest hydroelectric dam exists in the world. But you can see that wind is expanding and catching up. Solar is as well, a little bit slower, and then there's other renewables that like biomass, but wind really has potential of being, a major player in the renewable space. So, to summarize, wind energy is not new. We've been using wind as human societies since the origin of modern civilization. Modern wind turbines have gone through many periods of growth and development, and are now incredibly safe and sophisticated. These are major pieces of infrastructure that are highly technically, complex, but they are able to really harness the power of the wind. Offshore wind farms avoid many of the problems that are associated with terrestrial wind turbines, but they also pose unique human challenges, particularly among communities that live close to these installations. So, coastal communities and the people who live in those communities really have their own thoughts and feelings about these, which we're going to be talking about in a later module. So we can examine some statistics concerning wind energy, and we talked about some reasons why, other than climate change, to increase wind energy, the economic factors, the creation of jobs, and as a driver of the local economy. But of course, we always need to keep in the back of our mind that we're doing this not just for energy independence, not just for the creation of jobs, but we really are doing this to create a better environment for the future. I often say to people who live in coastal communities that, the mere existence of these communities that are by the shore are threatened by climate change that, affects the sea level. And so, I mean, if we want to have coastal communities in the future, we have to start taking steps in the direction of changing our reliance on fossil fuels. And finally, that New Jersey is uniquely poised to contribute to this effort due to its geography and its unique features. So, New Jersey is a really great place for this initiative to begin. So, if you're using these slides as PowerPoint slides, the next couple of slides have videos that you can link to that, if you're connected to the internet, will link you to a video. The first being a New Jersey Spotlight story on climate change in New Jersey. That is a great story. The second is the New Jersey Department of Energy film about wind energy. The third is an ITTV news story about the world's largest wind farm currently. And then finally, a PBS NewsHour story on the Biden administration push for wind energy. Of course, these are optional for you to watch. If you are watching this as part of the Canvas site, these films are linked directly in the actual Canvas module, so you can look at it there. Okay, well, thank you, and I look forward to seeing you in the next module.